WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore positively summertime now, and usually means this guy's eating pizza on the boardwalk in Wildwood sometime soon. I don't know how it's going to go here this summer, but I always hear that Alice Cooper song, "School's Out for the Summer." That would be the end of the Ravens, at least for a couple of weeks. They take a little downtime. They'll be back before you know it for that extra football game this year. Luke Jones joins us now from Owings Mills, where he's working on the farmer's tan here, at least early on, and watching a relatively uneventful camp by your own estimation. And I know folks are running out the Baltimore Positive to read the observations. Certainly were observations, but nothing too shocking this week, and certainly nobody hobbled up too much.
No, and that's what you want. You want an uneventful spring because that means you haven't suffered any catastrophic injuries that could alter the fate of your season. And we've seen that in the past. Tavon Young several years back, Dennis Pitta, his career comes to an end. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention there were a couple rookie free agents who got hurt and wound up on injured reserve, but no one that was expected to be part of their plan. So that's the first thing you like. And then the second thing is there's no major discussion about a quarterback competition or a new head coach and a new coaching staff or so much
arrest record.
well, you have that. So much roster turnover. I mean, things that you see in upwards of 6 to 12 NFL markets every year, right? I mean, you have quarterback dissension or quarterback controversy. You have a new head coach, a new staff, a new general manager who doesn't know the old players. I mean, they have stability. And that's not to say that there aren't other teams around the league that have that, but they are one of the few that they have so much stability. They've had that for a long time. Yes, they've had a quarterback transition in the last going back 3 years now, but you want a quiet spring. You want an uneventful spring because the focus then is on prepping for the regular season and not who the heck's going to be the quarterback week one, or does this head coach know what he's doing? Do these players respect the new head coach? Does this general manager know how to put together a roster? Those are questions the Ravens don't have to answer. And when you're talking about a team that's won 25 games over the last 2 years and been to the playoffs 3 straight years, 2 division titles over that stretch, you feel really good about it. So to your point, yeah, there are observations and there's certainly things we'll get into, but nothing that happened over the last few weeks feels all that terribly consequential to what they're going to do in the regular season. That's not to say it's meaningless, but these observations, whether we're talking about Lamar Jackson having an awesome day on Wednesday like he did, threw the ball as well as I saw him throw it all spring, or Tuesday where he didn't throw the ball as well, it's not really a referendum either way. It's just throwing the ball around and taking part in football activity in the spring. And that's what it is. And when you're a team coming off an 11-5 season, coming off another playoff trip, you want a quiet spring. And that's exactly what the Ravens were able to have. And I think John Harbaugh was very pleased to get through the mandatory minicamp and see what the veterans all look like. And then break up now over the next 5 weeks or so. They'll count down to the start of training camp in late July.
Luke, I'd say the expectations for the team become different now, right? It's not just you have an MVP quarterback or is he going to get paid? And as Harbaugh pointed out, he will get paid. It's going to be, will he be paid for, as Joe Flacco, winning a Super Bowl, or will it be a 13-3 disappointing year, a 10-6 year where they make it to the championship? I think when you say 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 places where there's instability, I don't know that there's really much more than a handful of places where they sort of expect to win the Super Bowl this year, right? And I think we've become one of those places where you really expect this team is a legitimate Super Bowl contender, not even what they might think they are in Cleveland or some other places, some upstart places where you have a quarterback on the ascension. I think there's a different level of expectation here as to the way the team is built. To your point, the stability of Roman and Martindale and Harbaugh and Justin Tucker and Sam Cook and players. And we saw Brandon Williams the other day, out on the one of the hostage videos. People that have been here a while. And where there is no controversy, there is no instability. There's only a lot of really good football players who've played a lot of really good football in September, October, November, December, whether it's on a Wednesday afternoon in Pittsburgh or whether it's on a Monday night in LA. This kid's obviously special, right? And so all of that baked into this, they have a level of expectation about going away the next 6 weeks that I think it does get heavier for the Mark Andrews and the Ronnie Stanleys and the guys that's really haven't won much outside of the one Nashville game last year, right? To say they have any pelt on their wall here, not at Alabama, not that and I know Bozeman thinks he's going to be a great center, and if he's a great center, they'll wind up losing him for $80 million to Tampa Bay or whatever. But because he might be a great center, because of the pedigree of guys like him, and then bringing in Zeitler and Villanueva, if I ran into Eric DeCosta somewhere and I actually had a word with him, it's been a while, I would say, you guys look like you're assembled right here, right now. When I see Calais Campbell out on the Zoom looking more silver than I am, and I'm 20 years older than him, and I start to think like people are asking him how many more years, 15 years, like all this. And I'm thinking, dude, if you ride off on a white horse on a surfboard in LA, on February, Valentine's, whenever they're having the Super Bowl next year, this is going to be that kind of team that has some senior citizens hanging around who are only around for one reason. They want to win. And in the case of the Zeitlers and the Lamar or Villanueva or Calais Campbell, the guys that signed up to come in here, they came in here because they think they can win with this kid. And people like Marshall Yanda probably told them they could.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And as much as we talked about the quiet elements of the spring that the Ravens are benefiting from, Kansas City's benefiting from, go down the list. I mean, certainly Tampa Bay after what they did and their ability to somehow bring everybody back. But what accompanies that is high expectations, right? I mean, if you're not talking about a quarterback controversy or a new head coach or new coordinators or so much roster turnover, then everyone's saying what? Well, you better win. And not just in the regular season, the Ravens have done that. And to your point, although we have to start thinking about it in different terms, it's no longer 13-3, it's 14-3, right? I mean, it's the 17 game schedule, which is going to be weird to get used to, but I mean, and we talked about this last year. This was the expectation last year. When you go 14-2 and lose in the divisional round in the way they did 2 years ago, of course it was Super Bowl or bust last year. And then we got into Ronnie Stanley gets hurt and Nick Boyle gets hurt, and teams seem to have a little bit of a better idea of not stopping this offense, but slowing it down. And we saw them struggle a little bit more. They still won games, but they didn't make it look quite as easy as they did the year before that. But it's going to be a similar story this year. To your point, what else can this team accomplish in the regular season? They went 14-2 2 years ago. They've been the number one seed. That didn't get them very far, unfortunately. So this comes back to January, and that's why. And I talked about this a little bit with Dennis as well, Dennis Kolatzis, that we can talk all we want about how guys look in the spring, and we'll do the same thing come training camp. And they'll even get into the regular season. And I feel this team is so incredibly well built to beat 90% of the teams in the league. And whatever the exact percentage is, it's just about every team in the league. They're built to beat, and in most cases, beat rather handily. And we've seen that the last 2 years with all the blowout wins. What's going to tell the story? What they do against those other teams that are as good or better than them. And that's where we've seen them really run into trouble the last couple of years in January. But that's where legacies are defined. And John Harbaugh and Lamar Jackson and Eric DeCosta, they'd be the first to tell you that. So as much as we look at this team and anticipate, they'll probably rush for maybe not 3,000 yards again, but somewhere in the high 2,000s at the very least. We know Lamar Jackson's going to run for a lot of yards. We know Mark Andrews is going to catch a lot of passes and catch touchdowns as one of the best tight ends in the AFC. We know the defense is going to be really strong, even if the pass rush is a question, because it was a question the last 2 years, and their defense was still really strong. So it's not to say that they have no imperfections. It's to say that they have so few flaws and so many obvious strengths that yeah, you do look at this team on paper, even breaking down the schedule and knowing what it looks like later in the season and all the divisional games down the stretch, and even acknowledging that Cleveland might be really good, and maybe Pittsburgh isn't ready to be buried just yet with Ben Roethlisberger, although I certainly have my questions there. Even if you acknowledge those two teams being good, I fully expect the Ravens to be really good again. So again, it's not to be dismissive of what they look like running around in helmets and shorts in May and June, but it's a case of how's that translate to January? And I'm not smart enough to know that just yet, but I think with some of the additions that they did make, and you mentioned it, Kevin Zeitler and Alejandro Villanueva, specifically with their offensive line, assuming Ronnie Stanley comes back healthy, and the expectation.
Let me not leave Watkins out of that too. I feel
remiss. I was going to get to him.
I feel I'm trying to name all the guys with every Weddle that's come and gone, and every Chris Canty that's come and gone. It does feel like, I mean, at this point, their defensive line, that's how they're going to build certain parts of this football team, right? Are these guys who sign up and say they win a lot in Baltimore, I want to go there and win, like Trevor Price, like Derek Mason, like so many players have, over the last 20 years. That's one thing this time of year that they don't have a lot of drama, because Earl Thomas aside, right? I mean, mistakes aside, they're usually pretty good about picking the right guys that come in here and stir drinks like good straws.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty fair. I think you've seen from, and this would probably fall into the analytics concept or category a little bit, but you've seen them kind of corner some veteran guys. As much as we talk about second contracts, and we've talked about how many draft picks that maybe day 2 or day 3 guys like Matthew Judon, for example, Zadarius Smith, guys who developed into Pro Bowl caliber players and end up getting paid elsewhere, and they get that comp pick. On the flip side, we've seen the Ravens then target guys who are coming off of their second contract, or maybe a cap casualty late in their second contract, and they're the ones that give a veteran player a third contract. So we've seen a little bit of that, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with Brandon Williams, for example. I asked him about his contract. It's strange. I feel like we were just talking about this current contract not that long ago, but that was 2017. It was a while ago. So, but those veterans that you bring in, I mean, their defensive line is almost exclusively that right now, other than Brandon Williams, who is a veteran now, but of course, homegrown, and Justin Madubuike, who did some really good things last year as a third-round pick and looks like a future starter for them, and might even be a starter by the time that the season's over. But you mentioned Sammy Watkins, and I think that's the interesting one. We talk so much about wide receiver. We don't need to rehash how the entire offseason played out, really how the last couple years have played out in that regard. And we can even go back longer than that if we really want to. But
I don't know that you've accused them of not addressing that issue, right? Like
in the past, yeah. And I'll stand by that 100%. In the draft,
and so will Joe Flacco probably, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
right. So at this point, other than spending Julio Jones money or whatever the money would have been for Robinson, pick any pie in the sky guy who was going to catch 120 balls. Antonio Brown, not sober, you know what I mean? Like normal. Well, whatever that guy is, that special guy that they could get. The kid from Houston that went off to Phoenix, right?
DeAndre Hopkins, yeah.
Right. So they could get that kind of player through free agency, through trade. Certainly to draft that kind of player, they've been cracking at that for years and years and years, going back to Clarence Moore and Travis Taylor and beyond, right? But what they did this year, there was so much screaming about it. DaCosta goes full Susan Lucci, right? Like we give him an Emmy, or was it an Oscar? I don't know. Was it on TV or was it a movie? It's an Emmy. I'll give him an Emmy when I see him. I'm so offended. How dare you? And then he goes and drafts these guys, right? So clearly they took it as seriously as your lips did back in January. And it doesn't always work that way, where I don't want to say hear the noise, where I would say they see the situation the same way the fans or the media do. This was one of those cases where I don't know what you want from them other than spending 1s, spending 3s, bringing in tight ends, You do, getting Sammy Watkins. I don't know what more you want them to do than what they've done the last 2 years with wide receiver.
Yeah, and they haven't spent, but you look at the draft capital that they have spent on the position. I mean, you go back to the Joe Flacco.
Hold on a second. I got to throw a Sid, because the Orioles are like terrible. I'm just going to poke at them. I got to throw a Sid Thrift Confederate money in here. When they're waving money around to wide receivers with their offense, it's Confederate.
Yeah.
Like, we found that out. Like, that's crazy. As much as I say, well, everybody wants to be involved.
Not at that position.
Who want to get the ball don't want to be here, right?
Sure, and I'm guessing if Sammy Watkins had more options and had not been hurt, as he was productive when he was on the field, but we know what the story was for him. It's been the story of his career. He probably wouldn't be here if he had other options. But now that
he's the only guy I've ever seen to be happy to be out of Kansas City. Well, I don't know. Le'Veon Bell apparently hates Andy Reid too. Right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I can recall Ravens fans clamoring for him a couple years ago.
Le'Veon Bell couldn't get along with, let's see, Mike Tomlin, Adam Gase, right? Gase is the right guy at the Jets, or was there somebody else there?
Adam Gase, although lots of people couldn't get along with him. So that's one maybe you could say, okay, we'll give you that one.
Peyton Manning got along with him. Right. That's all I know.
Right. But going back to what you said, I mean, I'm looking at their positional roster right now. As it stands right now, their 90-man roster in the preseason. You go down the list. Marquise Brown, first-round pick. Jalen Moore, rookie free agent last year, they kept on the practice squad. James Prochet, sixth-round pick last year. Rashad Bateman, first-round pick this year. Devin Duvernay, third-round pick last year. Sammy Watkins, a free agent signing. Tylan Wallace, fourth-round pick this year. Miles Boykin, third-round pick 2 years ago. You go down the list, and they've made a very reputable, very credible effort via the draft over these last 3 seasons, which coincides with Eric DeCosta taking over, does coincide with the transition from Joe Flacco to Lamar Jackson. They've made efforts to address the position. When you consider, go back 2008 through 2018, first round picks that they invested at the position, Rashad Perriman. Second round picks they invested at the position, Torrey Smith. And then after that, it's a bunch of day 3 guys, whether you're talking about Tandon Doss or Chris Moore or, Aaron Millette, Tommy Streeter, go down the list. I mean, Jordan Lastly, Jaleel Scott. I mean, just, and look, a 4th round pick's one thing, but when you're addressing that position with 5th, 6th, and 7th round picks, and you don't really have a history of developing wide receivers either, in the way that Pittsburgh has been able to do that with some late round guys, then yeah, you're not going to get better at the position. And then you're not spending in free agency. The last major trade acquisition from a wide receiver position standpoint that they have made was Anquan Bolden, and that was over a decade ago now at this point. So yeah, the effort has been there. We could certainly debate, especially when you look at what the asking price ultimately was with Julio Jones. I said that's something I think they should have, and I think they did consider, especially before the draft. Now, was Atlanta's asking price at that point in time what it ultimately ended up being that Tennessee pulled the trigger on? Don't get the sense that that's the case. So, but the point is they've made that investment. They've made an effort. Sammy Watkins, we'll see. Look, he's on a 1-year deal. This wasn't a steep commitment that they made in terms of dollars or years. And I'll say this, and you can check out my 12 Ravens thoughts at BaltimorePositive.com right now. Day 1 and day 2, play of the day each time, Lamar Jackson to Sammy Watkins. Play of the day each time, Marlon Humphrey in coverage on those 2 plays. And Marlon Humphrey's a gamer when it comes to practice. He's not. You see a lot of vets go through the motions and they'll take some reps off, and that's fine. I mean, I don't need to see Jimmy Smith trying to risk injury in June when he has trouble staying healthy in the fall. But there you go. I mean, they're building a rapport. And I think, based on what I saw from Sammy Watkins this spring, I think he can still be a productive player. I think he still is a good player. But the big key is going to be, can he stay on the field? And that's why kind of Kansas City moved on from him. That's why he didn't have a whole lot of interest in this market that had quite a few wide receivers available. So the good thing is, unlike 4 years ago, when you could have offered a similar sentiment about Jeremy Maclin, let's say, and we know how that turned out. You still have Marquise Brown, who played really well down the stretch last year, and 2 years into this thing hasn't been perfect, but hasn't been a bust either. You've now drafted Rashad Bateman. You have Mark Andrews, who's in the prime of his career and has already been to a Pro Bowl. So you have outs, you have options. And I as much as you're really hoping that it's more so Marquise Brown and Bateman and Mark Andrews, if Sammy Watkins stays healthy, based on what I've seen in practice, I think Lamar Jackson likes him because he's throwing the ball to him a lot, and they are building a rapport. So how does that translate come September? It's hard to say right now. And I can tell you plenty of guys. I remember Brashad Perriman looking great his first spring. On the flip side, I can tell you a guy who I thought looked not so impressive his first training camp was Mark Andrews. Looked slow, looked banged up. He had some nagging injuries. He wasn't the
prettier girl at the dance all along.
Right. I mean, he was the third. Yeah, I mean, everyone was focused on Hayden Hurst, and I can tell you privately, talking amongst us media members at that first training camp, we were wondering if that was going to end up being an IR redshirt situation. That's how underwhelming he looked at that point. And then, well, he ended up having a good rapport with Joe Flacco and an even better rapport with Lamar Jackson his rookie year. So you never really know. And that's my point in terms of these observations are fun. And look, it's fun talking about football right now. We know the season's still months away, but it's fun, right? Especially when you're talking about a baseball team who hasn't won a road game in a month and a half.
Well, do you want to pivot on that? I mean, do you really, what are we going to do?
Well, let me finish my thought though. But everything that we've seen this spring, there hasn't been anything that's occurred that deviates or diminishes expectations or creates greater concern. Look, the pass rush is a question mark, and it's going to continue to be whether they end up bringing in Justin Houston or not. Because we don't know if Oweh is going to look like a first-round pick from day one, and we know that he's a little green in that way. And you know that you lost Matt Judon and Yannick Ngakoue and Jahad Ward, left guard. As much as everyone's talking about Ben Cleveland and excited about him as a third-round pick, we'll see if it's him or Ben Powers or Tyree Phillips. And I don't know if any of those guys are going to do a great job there, but I feel much better about their 4 other spots if Ronnie Stanley's healthy. So, they have their question marks, and we'll see if Patrick Queen takes a step this year after kind of being really up and down last year. But right now in Kansas City Sports Talk Radio, they're talking about the question marks as far as their new offensive line and, whether they're going to be able to afford these guys, and the fact that their cap is structured the way it is now around their highest paid players. What does that look like for the cheaper guys on the roster? Do you have enough depth at each position? I mean, these are Tampa Bay, same thing, same exact discussions happening, and those are the 2 Super Bowl representatives. So, my overall point is, you get through the spring, you're healthy, you have lots of stability, lots of continuity. The new guys that you've brought in, I mean, John Harbaugh, I asked him about Zeitler and Villanueva. As advertised, he says they love football. They were there for OTAs. Villanueva was there every day. Zeitler was there for most of the spring, at least the ones open to media.
That's such a Harbaugh thing to say, right? Like, that lets you know right away
that he likes a guy. Yeah,
he likes him a lot. You know what I mean? Like,
right. And it's kind of a throwaway line.
His diction after 14 years.
Sure, of course. I mean? And it's a kind of a throwaway line.
I speak hardball. I speak carbs.
Because there are certainly guys who weren't there all spring that I can tell you they love football just fine too, but they understand what it takes to get ready for a season at this point.
You always bring up Michael Pierce, right? And that's the minute Harbaugh sees a guy that looks like that, he says, you don't love football enough, because if you were waking up thinking about football, you wouldn't look like that. You know what I mean? And that's the way John is as bad as old school Schembechler in that way as you're going to find, right? And that's probably okay. He, that's where the bar is, how much you love football. And I think they realized Earl Thomas had lots of other things he was interested in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Ray Lewis had lots of things he was interested in, but there was never a day Ray Lewis didn't love football. And John nobody in the building had to worry about that.
Well, and you just said it. And Ray Lewis didn't show up for a lot of OTAs. Let's be clear about that. We would talk about that every spring like it was some kind of story that mattered.
Ray Lewis stopped talking to me for 5 years over that.
I don't even know if it's, I mean, he calls it loving football. To me, it's being invested enough in your livelihood. And in Michael Pierce's case, that might have cost him a little bit of money. Now, he's still got a nice contract with Minnesota, but did he end up getting, and I can't remember what the terms were off the top of my head, did he end up getting as much as he might have been able to had he come into camp in great shape and been ready to have a career year? I think you could make an argument he cost himself some money there, and probably not that the Ravens would have been likely to invest in him long term, considering they had already paid Brandon Williams 2 years earlier. But I think you certainly could have looked at that and said, well, that might have closed the door on the Ravens even considering re-signing him. So there is that difference, and it has nothing to do with whether you're officially there for OTAs or not, because there are plenty of guys who, like Ray Lewis, for example. Ray was always ready come training camp, right? Or he was always ready come mandatory minicamp. You never ask that question. Suggs, would he look a little thick maybe at minicamp or to start a camp a couple years? Yeah, sure. But, again, you're talking about another guy who, borderline Hall of Famer, probably will be a Hall of Famer eventually. So, it's about how you prepare for the season.
Better not have me in the room.
how you prepare for the season, though. These younger guys, they depend on this much more. And I think, talking to Patrick Queen and some of the second-year guys, J.K. Dobbins, they talked about the value of being in Owings Mills this spring. And, that's kind of the contrasting comments that you get from the NFLPA, which is representing established veteran players who know what it takes to play in the league and be successful, and they've already made their money. So there is value to this time, but in the big picture, who's ready for the season opener in Las Vegas? And if they all are, we're not going to be talking about how Lamar Jackson looked on June 15th throwing the football around. I mean, we're just not, because it's not important. It's just not. There's value to it in the process, but the outcome of the reps, it's just not important. So that's why I throw my observations out there, and I appreciate everyone reading it at BaltimorePositive.com, and I certainly encourage it. But is it critical to what's going to happen in December and more, especially come January, where that's where this team's legacy is going to be defined? Not so much. They're building right now, and that's all it really is.
The Ravens gone fishing sign up, closed for business for a couple of weeks. Luke's headed to the beach. I am building things in a crab cake tour, Maryland Crab Cake Tour. Big appreciation to all of our sponsors. By the way, everybody's lifting in this thing. Our friends at Planet Fitness, we're getting together with them in Salisbury and Cumberland. Our friends at Wise Markets have a beautiful location in Frostburg that apparently is going to have some legit Maryland crab meat for me. And, of course, our friends at Royal Farms have chimed in that it is Chicken Palooza in the middle of my crab cake tour. So we're going to have a crab cake of Palooza. I know one thing we're not going to have, Luke Jones, is a pennant race here. And I was going to say, look at the time. We got to talk baseball.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to say, headed into another sort of lost summer of all this, other than next weekend? And I did check with Phil Rye, and you can check at BaltimorePositive.com if you want any information on the Bowie Bay Sox. We did a 45-minute conversation about all things Bay Sox and going down to a game. Friday or Saturday of next weekend are the nights that I'm looking at right now. So, let me know. You want to go down and see Grayson Rodriguez pitch, but the DL news is less than encouraging, right?
Yeah, and that's where, when you look at this thing, and Mike Elias, and he's preached this from day one, patience and understanding where they were. And we saw it. We saw it in 2018. You talk about a year where you go into the year with some design, some vision of maybe putting together putting the band back together one last time and holding on to Manny Machado and getting a wild card, and who knows what happens. We know that it was very much over at that point. It couldn't have been more obvious that it was over. So we knew that this was going to be a tedious, long, painful process. But when you see, and at this point in time, I don't think it's anything to panic about with DL Hall, but as these things generally go, it does appear minor initially in many cases, not all cases. Tyler Glass now for the Rays, partial UCL tear, and getting into all the grip and substance stuff and all of that, which we can talk about at some point in time.
By the way, wow, that's.
Oh yeah,
I don't have time for that today,
right.
But I watched the kid from the Rays, and I was like, wow.
Yeah, Well, and there is a lot more nuance to that whole debate than people want to make it out to be. And don't get me wrong, the spider tack, like, the blatant abuse of it is a problem. There's no question. But we'll table that for right now.
And Stickum. We'll make it through this too.
Yeah. We'll table that. And we'll certainly have a discussion because I think there's some fascinating elements to that.
All the accusations that baseball juices the balls and these sort of conspiracy theories that these guys believe, but then again, guys believed if they stepped on the line crossing first, that they would have bad luck. So there's a lot to it. Superstition in baseball and unwritten rules that I've just sort of given up. I'm just going to go watch the game is what
And by the way, the league at Major League Baseball absolutely loves this. They adore the fact that this is happening because it's creating dissension between pitchers and players and the MLB Players Association with CBA talks very much looming and the end of the CBA looming in the offseason. They love it because anytime the players are divided, that's just going to mean they're going to clean up more from a negotiating standpoint. So anyway, going back to DL Hall,
how dare you think the baseball owners are devious?
There's lots of devious behavior in Major League Baseball, and frankly, all sports. But baseball can't get out of its own way, and they kind of they draw the ire, and I have no sympathy for them. But talking about DL Hall, it appears minor. We'll see. You certainly want to be cautious, and we've talked about this though with this whole unprecedented 2020 and what impact it was going to have on pitchers. I mean, we haven't touched on it a whole lot just because the Orioles have been, there hasn't been a whole lot to say that hasn't been said over and over and over at the major league level as far as where they are. But injuries around baseball, pitching injuries. I mean, it's been a problem. Look how many, even John Means, who you think is a more minor type of situation, but you have pitchers who have had to get Tommy John. You've had other pitchers who've thrown no hitters who were on the shelf then.
These guys are all full effort every pitch when you're throwing 96, tough, man.
And then you throw into a shutdown because of the pandemic, a 60-game season. I mean, there's just so much to unpack there that was going to always disrupt this year. So, in a case of DL Hall, you hope it's minor. The early indications are that it's not a major concern. He had an MRI and they didn't see anything structural. Seems like it's more his tricep, a little bit higher up on the elbow than the forearm, which is usually what you worry more about as far as Tommy John surgery potentially. And flexor mass strains. I think that's what Hunter Harvey and Dylan Bundy had before they had to get their Tommy John surgeries years ago. So, but it's a reminder of, even with this rebuilding process and you're trying to build a pipeline of young talent, everything's not going to go perfectly. Look at Heston Kjerstad. I mean, dealing with myocarditis, and I think there's some mystery as far as how that happened. I mean, of course, people have asked COVID. The Orioles have been very tight-lipped, but there have been reports that it wasn't COVID related. I mean, regardless, it's something that you don't want, and it's something that a guy that you drafted second overall. With under slot, with the idea that you then spent extra bonus money on some of your other draft picks. I mean, it was strategic, and they did spend more and sign some guys that there were some serious signability issues with. But you come back to the second overall pick, and he's still not playing ball, and there's no timetable right now. And look, let's be very clear. This is a young man whose heart is having issues, and there's a life element to this that doesn't makes baseball very trivial in the here and now. But at the same time, if you're the organization, this is a kid that you envision being a big part of your future, and he's not able to play right now. So it's not
from a Ravens standpoint, I call it almost Sergio Kindley kind of. Yeah. Like, to have a player that you just.
Yeah. And
it has something that's not even related to the sport,
Right.
Injured.
Yeah. And again, that's not I don't want to close the book on him. He's not done. And myocarditis, look at Eduardo Rodriguez. I mean, last year he missed the season for the Red Sox. He's pitching again, and seems to be okay now and everything. But there are elements in life, whether we're talking about a pandemic, whether it was COVID or whether it wasn't COVID. I mean, that can happen.
Something that would really stunt your growth as a player at that point where you're trying to hit A pitching to get the double-A pitch, all the things that I'm going to hopefully see Grayson Rodriguez do and Adley Rutschman doing. Every time I look up, Rutschman's hitting home runs and rounding third base. that's going to be a limited time offer. But the notion that all these guys are coming along and there's not going to be, hey, Hall's arm hurts or whatever, that's part of all of this, right?
Sure. In the same way that
Palmer would tell you his arm hurt in the 60s, right?
Yeah. In the same way that you go back to 2013, the Ravens coming off of a Super Bowl, but we know they had cap issues. They give Joe Flacco the contract, they trade Anquan Bolden, they cut Bernard Pollard, Ed Reed departs in free agency, Ray Lewis rides off into the sunset. And what's their first draft pick? They take Matt Elam. And that didn't work out. So that even for the best organizations, like naming the Ravens there, not everything's going to go perfectly. And that's where it is difficult for this timeline. And that's where I have full empathy for fans who are looking at this thing and saying, okay, I'm being patient and I'm trying to remain as engaged as I can be. And that doesn't mean I'm watching every night, but I'm still watching somewhat regularly. But you're seeing the rundown debacle in Cleveland the other day, and you're seeing guys that are struggling to even get through 3 or 4 innings pitching, and you're seeing young guys that have really had an up and down seasons, like Mountcastle and Austin Hayes not being able to stay healthy. And
the hardest part's when you're losing the close games, the games where not when you're losing 4-0 in the first inning or second inning, and it's a bad night, and like Thursday afternoon was bad. But when you're in a 3-2 game, a 6-5 game, when it's the 8th inning and you need 1 hit, 1 run, whatever.
And it just doesn't come. And I think for me, what's really been frustrating of late, and I think you're seeing this with Brandon Hyde, who, look, I hear people criticize Brandon Hyde, and look, I don't know if Brandon Hyde's a great manager and going to be the guy that leads them to a World Series hypothetically one day. And history would suggest probably not. If you kind of look at Bo Porter and then AJ Hinch in Houston. I mean, there's a perfect example there. Not to say that Mike Elias is sitting there right now and saying, yeah, well, we're going to fire Brandon Hyde in 2 years. But we know how that typically works. We know how that often works. I think what's been really frustrating for me has been some of the more woeful defensive breakdowns. We know the talent's lacking, obviously, on this roster. There are way too many quad A and placeholders and has-beens. We know that, but we knew that going into the season. But when you see such fundamentally inept examples where guys don't know how to cover a rundown, that's what bothers me. At least lose like major leaguers. Does that make sense? I mean, there's a winner and a loser every night, every game you play, right?
There are highlights with your losers.
Yes. And that's where we saw it with the Pirates a few weeks back with Javi Baez of the Cubs between home and first, which was one of the all-time great bloopers ever. But we saw it with the Orioles with the rundown the other day. I mean, it's not good. And those are the types of moments where I look at Brandon Hyde and the coaching staff, and I know they're going over these things with these guys, but you get to a point where you wonder if some of these guys are just, not that they're checking out, that they don't care, but you get to a point where you haven't won a road game for 6 weeks and you're 20 plus games below 500 and you're out of the pennant race already, and it's not even the 4th of July. That's where you do wonder if focus
maybe
is suffering.
Another voice.
Not even so much that, but I just think collectively it gets to a point where that's a lot. It's not easy. We've said it over and over. As much as a rebuild was what they needed to do, and as much as from 98 through 2011, that's what drove me crazy. It was always these half measures. It's really tough. It's really brutal to go through this, and it's brutal to watch. So if it's brutal to watch, just imagine being in that dugout every night and
getting
experiencing
on the plane
this.
And going to doing all of
it's
that.
A drain.
Right.
I mean, there's a human element to this that we don't talk about because it is a business and it is a results-oriented industry. But boy, it has to be difficult if you look at it.
For Trey Mancini and Cedric Mullins and those guys to hit their way out of here, right?
Yes.
That's
Mancini. Mullins. I mean, we'll talk, and we'll talk about this as we get closer to the trade deadline. But I think Mancini. I'd love to see Trey get an opportunity to go to a winner after what he's been through over the last calendar year plus. And
I said that about Messina back 20 years ago, so we saw how that worked out. He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, and you can find him out on Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn and all these other places. Not so much soon, because he will be stuffing his face with pizza somewhere in the swamps of Jersey before training camp begins. But he and I will be getting together, talking some baseball and some football. And, the Trotzes are playing hockey, and the golfers are golfing, and the golfers are coming here, and we have things happening around here. Certainly the Crab Cake Tour, not withstanding, as we get that thing going here in July as well. Heritage Fair next week as well. Guys from Crack the Sky coming on. I had Cheap Trick, Rick Nielsen on this week. So it's been a good week around here. Hope you guys are enjoying all that we're doing. We are WNST, Towson, Baltimore, AM 1570. We never stop talking Baltimore positive.